When Putin invaded Ukraine, he also decided to cut Russia off from most of the world. Big mistake. 17 months into the war that was supposed to end in a few days, Russia is now the most sanctioned country on the planet. The sanctions on it exceed even those placed on Iran and North Korea, and many of Russia's supposed besties aren't too keen on coming to its defense, even China. One of Russia's few allies is Belarus, but what if this relationship is not as close as Putin imagines? Could Belarus even decide to use nuclear weapons as a means of leverage against its larger neighbor? Let's take a look at the tangled relationship between Russia and Belarus, starting with Belarus's involvement in the Wagner Rebellion. When Belarus intervened in the Wagner Rebellion in Russia at the end of June, its authoritarian ruler, President Alexander Lukashenko, diffused the situation when he offered to host Wagner's mutinous leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, at his capital in Minsk. Prigozhin accepted and began a very short-lived exile there, ending the rebellion. Prigozhin has supposedly left Belarus as of July 10th, but Lukashenko's intervention in the Wagner Rebellion shows the extent to which Russian and Belarusian politics are intertwined. Belarus was also in the news at the beginning of the war, when Russian troops used its territory as a staging point for their failed attack on Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. Belarus was also one of only a handful of countries to vote against a United Nations resolution which condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, something that even China did not do. It rather abstained from voting either way. Instead, Belarus voted against the condemnation and blamed NATO for the war. The moves earned Belarus new sanctions and further distrust by the international community. This distrust built on very recent history. Belarus's presidential election of 2020 was widely regarded by international observers as being corrupt rather than free and fair. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the European Union all refused to recognize Alexander Lukashenko as the winner of the election, and therefore the legitimate president of Belarus. For Lukashenko, though, the election was standard operating procedure. He even once referred to himself as the last dictator in Europe in a 2012 interview with Reuters, though he tried to distance himself from the negative implications of that word, saying he is not a bad person at all. International observers have regarded all of Belarus's elections since 1994 as being neither free nor fair. Lukashenko's relationship with Vladimir Putin has always been politically and personally close. Lukashenko depends on Putin's support to remain in power, and Belarus is essentially a client state for the Russian Federation. The protests in 2020 which followed the controversial election only strengthened Putin's hold on Lukashenko. For Russia, the existence of Belarus has served a useful geopolitical purpose. It has acted as a friendly buffer state between it and NATO, Poland in particular. Belarus as an independent state within Russia's orbit allows Moscow to shore up its western frontier without directly paying the costs for its defense. However, as NATO has expanded to encompass the Baltic countries and, in 2023, Finland, Russia's calculations toward the usefulness of Belarus's independence may be starting to change. In 2023, reports began to circulate that the Kremlin might be eyeing a full annexation of Belarus by 2030. But why would it desire to do this and put itself even more on NATO's collective border? The war in Ukraine may have been a reason for the Kremlin to shift some of its long-standing policy toward Belarus. While Belarus hosted Russian troops that took part in the Battle of Kyiv, it did not commit its own forces to that campaign. Lukashenko may be a close ally of Putin, but he was not eager to join his war directly. Belarus has stated it would only become an active combatant in Ukraine if it is attacked. As time has gone on and the war continues with no end in sight, Lukashenko must be convinced that he made the right decision. Belarus may be an economically and politically isolated country, but it is not nearly as isolated as its main benefactor. The lack of a complete unity of interest between Belarus and Russia poses problems for the latter. With Belarus as an independent country, Russia lacks a way to put pressure on Ukraine's capital at a moment's notice. It also lacks the easiest way to deploy troops on the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, outside of the confined and surrounded enclave of Kaliningrad. If Belarus were annexed to Russia, it would have more options to station assets to put pressure on Ukraine and NATO at any time the Kremlin wanted. For example, an annexation of Belarus would put Russia's western border at the Suwalki Gap, a narrow line that stretches from Russian Kaliningrad to Belarus's western border, near Grodno. A pincer drive from Grodno and Kaliningrad would be able to cut Poland off from Lithuania and isolate the Baltic states from the rest of NATO by land. However, this option is not available to the Kremlin unless Belarus allows it. Russia and Putin have long been contemptuous of the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and eager to project more power into the Baltic. The threat of cutting those states off from the rest of NATO over land would be a valuable strategic option for Russia to be able to exercise in its foreign policy. An annexation of Belarus would mean that Russia would no longer need to go through diplomatic channels to exercise its military leverage there. Though Lukashenko is usually keen to please Russia, there is no guarantee that will be the case in the future whenever Belarus gets a new leader, and Lukashenko has already diverged from some of the Kremlin's military goals in Ukraine. With Russia now isolated from much of the world, the Kremlin will look for additional options to exert leverage over NATO, meaning the existence of Belarus as a buffer state may no longer be within what it deems are its best interests. In 2023, a 17-page leaked document from Moscow with the title "Strategic Goals of the Russian Federation in Belarus" began to circulate. This document is one which Western intelligence services view as authentic. Some of the document's headlines include the plan for Russia and Belarus to come under the same currency, presumably the Russian ruble, taxation system, and military command by 2030. These goals would be in line for the project of a so-called Greater Russia, a notion that Vladimir Putin brought up in early 2022 with a 5,000-word essay that is now seen as his ideological reasoning for starting the war in Ukraine. Putin declared annexation of the occupied territories in Ukraine, where local residents have now been told they are considered Russian citizens and should apply for Russian passports. It would also be consistent with the Greater Russia idea and is also consistent with the Kremlin's supposed goals in Belarus. The Strategic Goals of the Russian Federation in Belarus document goes over short, medium, and long-term goals for the Kremlin in Belarus. The short-term goals include a greater voice for Russia in Belarusian domestic politics, including a reform to its constitution to serve Russian interests. It also intends to limit pro-Western dissent in that country of the type seen after the 2020 elections there. Lukashenko has already largely acceded to these demands. In the intermediate term, all Belarusian citizens would be able to obtain Russian passports, an expression of the same policy that Russia is pursuing in the territories it currently occupies in Ukraine. In the long term, Russia would seek to control information in Belarus and forge a shared national identity through media and cultural connections, among others. Russian news and Russian pop culture would drown out other sources of information within Belarus. 2030 is an ambitious goal for such a far-reaching project, but according to the document, that is Moscow's aim. Although this document might seem like a revolution, it is actually only an acceleration of long-standing Russian policy. Reportedly, Russia has had plans to annex Belarus as early as 1999, the year Vladimir Putin first assumed power. That year, Russia and Belarus signed the agreement on the establishment of the Union State. Some years later, when Russia granted its smaller neighbor a discount on its oil exports, Belarus needed to make more concessions in return. These concessions included Moscow assuming more and more political influence in Minsk. Lukashenko, though close with Russia, had tried to retain as much autonomy as he could while remaining largely sympathetic to Russian interests. 2020 would prove a turning point, however. The troubles in Belarus between 2020 and 2021 gave the Kremlin even more influence there. With the help of the Russian intelligence service, the FSB, the Belarusian security apparatus put down the anti-government wave of protests that emerged in the wake of the questionable 2020 presidential election in Belarus. There was a price to be paid for this support, however. Lukashenko now owed Moscow even more for his position. As early as March 2021, almost a year before the invasion of Ukraine, the Atlantic Council was warning of Russia's coming soft takeover of Belarus. According to the Atlantic Council, this soft takeover of Belarus would not be something spectacular, like the way Russia intervened in Ukraine in 2014 or in Georgia in 2008. Instead, it would be a frog in boiling water operation. The oil discounts from the years earlier were part of this. Lukashenko had been resisting Moscow's insistence that he export the refined petroleum products that came from this discounted oil through Russian ports. He instead routed them through ports in NATO members Latvia and Lithuania. The move ensured that the Belarusian economy would not be completely dependent on Russia. But in early 2021, Lukashenko changed course, and Belarus is now exporting these products through Russian ports. Russia's helping him out of the domestic troubles he faced in 2020 and 2021 came with consequences. Meanwhile, even before the war in Ukraine, Russia was steadily building up a large military presence in Belarus. Shortly before the invasion, Russia and Belarus signed a 5-year strategic partnership agreement that would see the construction of 3 joint military centers. 2 would be in Russian territory. The third would be in the western Grodno region of Belarus, near the Suwalki Gap. Lukashenko also conceded that Russia would be able to build a new Russian airbase on Belarusian territory, an effort he had resisted for a long time. In 2022, even after the failed attempt to take Kyiv, Russia still maintained a significant military presence in Belarus. In the fall of that year, it stationed 9,000 troops on the border between Belarus and Ukraine, hoping to tie down Ukrainian forces in that area and prevent them from reinforcing the fronts near Kharkiv and Kherson, where Ukraine was retaking vast swathes of captured territory from the invaders. According to the leaked annexation document, the Russian military presence in Belarus will continue to expand until it becomes permanent and the Belarusian army is subordinated to the Russian one. This will be one of its long-term goals to be achieved by 2030. Despite all of Russia's far-reaching aims, the Atlantic Council does not expect there to be a formal, lawful annexation of Belarus. Rather, the Russian expanding intervention in Belarus will be more like a grey zone operation. Russia would be in control of Belarus, in fact, while leaving its current borders formally intact. For Putin and the Kremlin, it would be better to make these moves now, with Lukashenko still in power. The unrest following the heavily criticized election of 2020 must have made Moscow remember what happened in Ukraine between 2013 and 2014. The last thing the Kremlin would want to see is a similar regime change in Belarus, which could take that country too further into the orbit of the West and away from Russia. Putin's intervention in favor of Lukashenko came with consequences of their own, as his propping up of the dictator made the people of Belarus less trustful of Russia and more pro-Western in sentiment. Shades of the Maidan movement in Ukraine almost a decade earlier were impossible to ignore for Moscow, and this may have sped up the long-held annexation plans. These underlying tensions may be a problem for Russia, as it supposedly begins to deploy some of its nuclear weapons on bases in Belarusian territory. On June 14, 2023, Lukashenko announced that his country had started to take delivery of some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons, which, according to him, were up to 3 times as powerful as the bombs the United States dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. If this is true, it would be the first time that Russia has deployed part of its nuclear arsenal on non-Russian territory since the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia, of course, would retain its control of the nuclear weapons. Putin stated that these weapons would be deployed upon completion of special storage facilities on the territory of its smaller neighbor. Russia's dictator partially justified the plan, which came in the face of international opposition, by pointing out how the United States had deployed its own nuclear arsenal on the soils of allied countries over many decades. In other words, he said he was creating something like a Russian nuclear umbrella to rival the long-standing American version. Lukashenko declared that Belarus still had nuclear storage facilities from the Soviet era and would be fixing them to host the new weapons. In an earlier statement, he declared his willingness and ability to host longer-range missiles, presumably capable of delivering strategic nuclear warheads if the need arose. Lukashenko's justification for the deployment of these weapons was that Belarus had always been a target and needed them for deterrence, especially in the wake of the West's attempt to topple him following the 2020 election, according to him. It is important to understand that both Putin and Belarus's dictator are known for using hyperbolic rhetoric. It has not yet been independently confirmed that Russia has begun delivering some of its nuclear weapons onto Belarusian soil as of July 10, 2023. If delivery has not yet begun, Russia may have second thoughts. For Moscow, the deployment of these weapons on the territory of a still independent country, even one that it has close ties with, comes at the price of several risks. Although the Belarusian government will not have control over these weapons, its agreeing to act as a host nevertheless exposes Russia to risk. Recall that in the Belgorod raid from May, 2 groups of dissident Russian fighters came within miles of a nuclear weapons storage facility. Unlike the United States' network of allies and nuclear umbrella partners, Belarus is far from a stable country. The world witnessed that firsthand in 2020 and 2021. Meanwhile, the Russians have unfortunately shown that they cannot always be relied on to keep their nuclear weapons stored without worries. What if instability in Belarus springs up again? Belarus's constitution mandates another formal election in 2025, the year that Russia wishes to meet some of its intermediate goals in its supposed annexation plan. Suppressing any unrest that springs up in Belarus in response to the coming unfree and unfair election will be a high priority for Russia. The presence of nuclear weapons in Belarus raises the stakes. In an interview for the Radio Times, William Courtney, the former special assistant for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Clinton administration, noted that pilots from the United States' NATO allies are trained to deliver American nuclear weapons from their respective countries' soil as part of the standard operating procedure for the alliance. That involves a level of trust that the Russians would never have in the Belarusians. Courtney said in the interview, because the Belarusian pilot might go in the opposite direction with that nuclear weapon, east, rather than west. He brought up the 2020 and 2021 protests against Lukashenko and, by extension, Russian influence in Belarus. It is little wonder why some Belarusian elements might seize the opportunity to use nuclear leverage over Russia if they got the chance, and why the Russians do not trust them like the United States trusts its NATO allies. This is why suppressing nationalist elements is a key short-term goal outlined in Russia's leaked document about its supposed annexation plans in Belarus. And then there is Lukashenko himself. It is human nature to seek more power and possessions, but an even stronger desire is to not lose the things one already has. This is especially true of power. Powerful people do not want to lose their power. This would be particularly so with someone like Alexander Lukashenko, who has exercised power in almost unlimited form for 30 years. Lukashenko may usually be eager to please his overlord Putin, but that does not mean he is eager to do so at the cost of losing his own position, should the so-called United State between Russia and Belarus evolve into outright annexation. Unfortunately for Belarus's long-standing dictator, he is running out of options. He is trapped between the West, refusing to recognize his legitimacy, and Russia, which seems to be accelerating its plans to annex Belarus and leave him a ceremonial figure at best. For 3 decades, Lukashenko has been able to keep the Kremlin mostly pleased, while also maintaining most of his initiative to govern Belarus as he saw fit. The disputed 2020 election in Belarus and Moscow's subsequent intervention to put down the unrest between then and early 2021 changed the balance of power, though shifting it yet more in Russia's favor. The balance of power again changed after the invasion of Ukraine, and Lukashenko lost even more clout in his relationship with Putin. How might he be able to claw some of it back? One way that Belarus's dictator might try to regain some leverage in the bilateral relationship with Russia could be to use nuclear weapons that he is supposedly about to host on his own soil as a form of leverage. Although he will not be able to actually launch these weapons, he does control the territory from which they would be based and supplied. Lukashenko can use his control of that territory to attempt to demand concessions from the Kremlin. That is only speculation, but the Russian plan to annex Belarus exposes that the two countries' partnership is not all that it seems. The interests of the dictators do not tend to make for a long, stable partnership. Their views of the world can diverge quickly, and their people tend to have concerns of their own. Russia once thought that Ukraine was safely in its orbit too, until its people looked to the West and refused further integration with the Russian economy, revolting against the ruling regime in Kyiv to ensure that would not happen. When new pro-Western leaders came to power in Kyiv, Ukraine's long-running status as being within Russia's sphere of influence deteriorated rapidly, to the extent that Russia is now fighting a costly war to keep Ukraine in its orbit. But what do you think? Might the same thing one day happen in Belarus? Or might Lukashenko or an authoritarian successor of his prove a less trustworthy partner for a Russian version of the nuclear umbrella? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.